To understand the tectonic geopolitical fracture emerging in early 2026 is to witness the terminal convulsions of late-stage capitalism as it confronts its own inevitable contradictions, for what the bourgeois intelligence apparatus euphemistically terms a polycrisis is in reality the violent unraveling of the neoliberal consensus that has held the global South in a stranglehold since the collapse of the Soviet Union. The structural rupture described in these intelligence briefings is not an anomaly, but a systemic necessity, a desperate and flailing attempt by the declining American hegemon to maintain its rate of profit through the primitive accumulation of resources and the militarized enforcement of the dollar standard in a world that is rapidly rejecting the Washington Consensus. We are observing the synchronized collapse of the post-Cold War order, not because of bad actors or rogue states, but because the mechanisms of imperial extraction that fueled Western prosperity are finally meeting the dialectical resistance of a multipolar reality. The United States, standing at the epicenter of this geopolitical storm, is not a victim of circumstance but the architect of its own demise, having built a fragile empire on the dual pillars of financial speculation and military coercion, both of which are now crumbling under the weight of historical materialism. The report's framing of these events as a geopolitical thriller is a telling revelation of the Western psyche, which views the starvation of nations and the incineration of cities not as human tragedies, but as plot points in a narrative of consumption. Yet the reality for the global proletariat is that the protagonists of this drama, the finance capitalists, the defense contractors, and the energy conglomerates, are indeed running out of time as the tangible material constraints of geology and the fierce will of colonized peoples assert themselves against the abstractions of Wall Street. The violent repartitioning of global energy assets is merely the latest chapter in the long, bloody history of enclosure, where the commons of the earth are fenced off by the bayonet to ensure that the surplus value flows northward, while the weaponization of supply chains represents the inherent fragility of a globalized system designed not for resilience, but for the maximization of arbitrage and the exploitation of cheap labor. When we analyze the so-called Venezuela paradox, we must strip away the liberal veneer of restoring democracy to reveal the naked, grinding machinery of resource imperialism in its most archaic form. For the audacious military intervention to capture Nicolás Maduro is nothing less than a neo-colonial raid disguised as humanitarianism, a frantic maneuver by the U.S. imperial state to seize the heavy crude essential for the metabolism of its Gulf Coast refineries. This is not about human rights. It is about the specific chemical composition of hydrocarbons required to maintain the profitability of American industrial capital, exposing the uncomfortable truth that the US shale revolution was a financial bubble built on light, sweet crude that its own refineries cannot process efficiently, creating a dependency on the very nations it seeks to subjugate. The Operation Absolute Resolve is a cynical rebranding of the Monroe Doctrine for the 21st century, a forceful assertion that the natural resources of Latin America belong by divine right to the shareholders of ExxonMobil and Chevron, and the resulting crash in U.S. shale stocks is a supreme irony of the market, demonstrating that the interests of domestic drillers are diametrically opposed to the interests of the transnational refiners who crave Venezuelan sludge, proving once again that the capitalist class is not a monolith, but a snake eating its own tail. The devastation of Venezuela's oil infrastructure is the direct result of economic warfare and sanctions, a siege tactic medieval in nature but modern in execution, designed to degrade the state capacity of a sovereign nation until it can be bought for pennies on the dollar by Western reconstruction firms, a cycle of destruction and profit that is the hallmark of disaster capitalism. Simultaneously, the conflict displaces Chinese influence, turning the Caribbean into a theater of inter-imperialist rivalry, where the Venezuelan people are mere pawns in a zero-sum game of hegemonic maintenance, while the reinstalling of the petrodollar serves to delay the inevitable flight from a currency weaponized against half the planet. Shifting our gaze to the rare earth stranglehold, we see the chickens of globalization coming home to roost as the deindustrialization of the West, championed by the neoliberal economists to crush domestic labor unions and exploit the Chinese proletariat, has created a fatal dependency on the very rival the U.S. now seeks to contain. The silent blockade is not merely a trade dispute, but the material manifestation of the contradiction between the forces of production and the relations of production. The U.S. military-industrial complex, that bloated parasite on the American taxpayer, finds itself impotent, unable to forge the missiles and guidance systems of empire, because it outsourced the processing of the very elements of warfare to Beijing in search of higher quarterly returns. This is the supreme indictment of the capitalist mode of production. It prioritizes short-term accumulation over long-term strategic viability, leaving the arsenal of democracy hollowed out and dependent on the supply chains of its adversary, a dialectical inversion where the master becomes the slave of the servant's industrial capacity. The specific targeting of processing technology by China serves as a reminder that control over the means of production, the ability to turn raw earth into the magnets of power, is the true currency of sovereignty, and the G7's panic is the realization that they have financialized their economies to the point of impotence, trading real industrial power for the fictitious capital of derivatives and service economies. The green transition, sold to the masses as a moral imperative, is exposed here as another arena of accumulation and geopolitical conflict, where the shift to renewables is threatened not by a lack of will, but by the stark realities of mineral extraction and the monopolization of the periodic table by a state that refuses to bow to Western hegemony. Meanwhile, the Persian nuclear anarchy represents the inevitable blowback of decades of interventionism, covert operations, and economic strangulation visited upon the Iranian people, whose revolutionary fervor is now being cynically assessed not for its emancipatory potential, but for the risk it poses to the stability of oil markets and the non-proliferation regime that ensures only the imperial core possesses the ultimate monopoly on violence. The prospect of loose nukes is the ultimate nightmare of the security state, yet it is a nightmare of their own making, a product of their relentless efforts to fracture the Iranian state, creating a power vacuum that will be filled not by liberal Democrats, but by warlords and factions born of desperation and siege. The frantic U.S. reassessment and the planning of Operation Midnight Hammer reveal that the true concern is not the welfare of the protesters, who are useful only as instruments of regime change, but the security of the Strait of Hormuz, the jugular vein of global fossil capital, proving that in the calculus of empire, the flow of oil matters infinitely more than the flow of blood. The shift of focus to the Cape of Conflict marks the definitive end of the Mare Nostrum era of American naval dominance, as the closure of the Red Sea and the militarization of the Cape of Good Hope signal a return to the contestation of the global commons, where the Global South, led by the BRICS formation, is actively constructing a parallel logistical architecture to bypass the choke points controlled by the West. The Will for Peace 2026 exercises are a performative rejection of the unipolar order, a declaration that the sea lanes which carried the slave ships of the past and the container ships of the present are no longer the exclusive property of the NATO alliance, and the distance tax, imposed by the rerouting of trade, is a levy on the Western working class, a direct transfer of wealth from the consumer to the shipping magnates and the insurers who profit from the chaos. This polycrisis is therefore a systemic crisis of accumulation, where the declining rate of profit drives the imperial center to increasingly violent and desperate measures to secure markets, resources, and hegemony, creating a feedback loop of instability that threatens to engulf the entire planet in a conflagration of resource wars, nuclear anarchy, and economic collapse. The recommendation for the investor to pivot to strategic commodities is a ghoulish advice to profit from the dismantling of the world, to bet on the scarcity and suffering that the system produces, while the policy watcher is urged to observe the technocratic maneuvering that masks the brutality of the underlying class war. We are witnessing the transition from a world of covert exploitation to one of overt conflict, where the illusions of the peace dividend and the end of history are shattered by the hard realities of hypersonic missiles, supply chain warfare, and the undeniable fact that the periphery is revolting against the core, demanding a reckoning for centuries of extraction and humiliation. The fracture is total, the dialectic is merciless, and the only certainty is that the capital accumulation strategies of the past are the death warrants of the future.